In the red desert of Arizona, after a violent dust storm, 8 female elephants formed a silent circle around a baby calf lying motionless on the ground. No one knew if little Annie was still alive. The rescue team wanted to rush in, but her mother, Ruby, blocked them with her body, as if the whole world was trying to take away the last thing she had left. For 3 days, the herd refused to leave. They were not guarding a miracle. They were waiting for one heartbroken mother to finally say goodbye. Before sunrise, the desert still held the last cool breath of night. Red Mesa Elephant Sanctuary lay quiet beneath a pale Arizona sky, its fences half buried in wind-blown sand, its water tanks humming softly in the distance. Ruby stood near the dry wash with her ears loose and heavy, watching the horizon as if she had been waiting for it to explain something. The storm had passed hours earlier, but its dust still clung to everything. It painted Ruby's back, settled in the folds around her eyes, and turned her dark skin the color of old clay. Beside her, little Annie should have been nudging at her legs, impatient for morning, reaching for milk, bumping her soft head into the world as if nothing in it could ever break. But Annie was not standing. Ruby had found her before the humans woke. The calf lay on her side in a shallow place where the storm had carved the ground open and covered the edges again with red sand. One small ear was folded beneath her cheek. Her trunk rested in a curve, too still for sleep. Ruby touched her once, then again, then stood over her as the sky slowly brightened. At first, Ruby made no sound. She only lowered her trunk to Annie's face, breathing over her, tasting dust, skin, and the faint memory of milk. Around her, the other elephants began to gather, pulled by something deeper than alarm. Martha came first, old and broad, her torn left ear lifting in the morning wind. Then Daisy, young and restless, stopped short when she saw the calf. By the time the sun broke over the red ridge, 8 elephants had formed a circle. They did not crowd Annie. They did not flee. They stood with their bodies facing outward, their shadows joining in the dust like the walls of a chapel. Ruby stayed nearest to her daughter's head, still enough to seem carved from the land, except for her trunk returning again and again to Annie's face. Clara Bennett saw them from the North Service Road. She had been driving slowly after the storm, checking fences for damage, expecting broken branches or a loose gate. Instead, she saw the circle. Her truck rolled to a stop by itself, as if her foot had forgotten what it was doing. Through the windshield, she could not see Annie yet. She only saw Ruby blocking the center. Clara stepped out carefully, one hand on the open door. She had worked at Red Mesa long enough to know when an elephant was frightened, angry, or playful. This was none of those things. Ruby's body carried a silence that made Clara's chest tighten. The mother did not charge. She did not trumpet. She simply turned her head and looked at Clara, as if warning her not to bring the human world any closer. A radio crackled at Clara's hip. Luke Harris was asking if she needed help near the wash. She reached for the button, then hesitated. Ruby had lowered her trunk again, touching Annie's mouth, then the hollow below her eye. It was so gentle that Clara felt suddenly ashamed of the keys hanging from her belt. The truck behind her, the tools and rules and emergency plans made for moments that might not belong to people. When Clara finally answered, her voice was low. She told Luke to call Dr. Hannah Cole, but not to bring the crew in yet. No sirens, no engines past the service gate, no shouting. Luke asked what was wrong, and Clara looked through the dust until she saw the small shape on the ground between Ruby's legs. For a moment, the whole morning seemed to fall silent around that one answer. Ruby shifted then, not away from Annie, but around her. She placed one massive foot forward, making herself a living wall between the calf and the road. Martha matched the movement on the far side. Daisy tried to step closer to Annie, her young trunk trembling, but Martha touched her shoulder and eased her back into the circle. Even grief, Clara realized, seemed to have rules here. The first sun warmed the dust, and flies began to gather. Ruby noticed them before anyone else. She swept them away from Annie's face with the tip of her trunk, careful as a hand brushing hair from a sleeping child. Then she paused, waiting for a breath that did not come. Her ears tightened for one small second, and Clara felt the sight of it move through her like a quiet wound. By mid-morning, Dr. Hannah's white veterinary truck waited far up the road. Engine off. Luke stood beside it with his cap in his hands, staring toward the circle. None of them spoke loudly. None of them moved forward. Ruby had made the boundary clear, without rage, without violence, without one wasted gesture. Annie was inside the circle, and the circle belonged to the herd. Clara raised her binoculars once and lowered them almost immediately. She had spent years in emergency rooms, running toward pain, pushing hands against wounds, refusing to let silence win. But Ruby's stillness asked for something different. The mother was not asking for rescue yet. She was asking for space, for time, for the right to stand between her child and every force that wanted an answer. As the morning stretched over Red Mesa, the sanctuary seemed to hold its breath. The humans waited beyond the dust. The old matriarch watched the wind. The younger elephants trembled and stayed. And at the center of them all, Ruby touched Annie again, soft and slow, as if love itself could still find a way through the silence. Ruby did not understand the words coming through Clara's radio, but she understood the change in the air. Human voices had begun to gather at the edge of the wash, low at first, then sharper with worry. The mother kept her body between them and Annie, her ears half open, her trunk resting near the calf's cheek like a promise she refused to break. Clara Bennett stood beyond the service road, watching Ruby with the kind of stillness that did not come naturally to her. For 30 years, she had moved towards sirens, blood, broken glass, and the thin blue light of hospital monitors. Her hands had been trained to act before fear could take shape. But Ruby's silence made every old instinct feel too loud. The veterinary truck arrived without sirens, just as Clara had ordered. Dr. Hannah Cole stepped out slowly, carrying a small case instead of the full emergency kit. She was young enough to still believe most outcomes could be improved with the right tool, yet experienced enough to know elephants did not always allow human plans to matter. Luke Harris followed behind her, dust on his jeans, worry hardening his face. He had helped repair fences, haul feed, and fix water lines for Ruby since Annie was born. He had watched the calf chase ravens across the yard like a clumsy little miracle. Now he stood staring at the circle, his jaw tight, unable to accept that standing still could be useful. Ruby saw them gather. Her trunk lifted from Annie's face and curled slightly, tasting their scent across the warm wind. She smelled rubber tires, metal, medicine, sweat, and fear. None of it belonged near the calf. The mother shifted her weight forward, not charging, not threatening, only making herself larger in the way grief sometimes does when it has no language. Dr. Hannah raised a thermal viewer to her eyes, but the angle was poor. Annie lay partly hidden behind Ruby's legs and Martha's broad shoulder. Hannah could not get a clean reading from where she stood. She whispered that they needed to come closer, just a little closer, before the heat climbed and the day stole whatever chance might still remain. Clara heard the words and felt her past rise inside her. She remembered a boy in Phoenix who had stopped breathing after a highway crash, his mother screaming behind the curtain while Clara pressed air into his lungs. She remembered how doing something had once felt like mercy. Now, watching Ruby guard Annie, she wondered if mercy could also mean restraint. Luke could not hold his silence. He stepped forward one pace, only one, but Ruby reacted before any human could speak. Her head lifted. Martha answered from the far side of the circle, swinging her trunk low over the dust. Daisy trembled behind her, confused and frightened, while the other females drew closer around Annie until the calf vanished almost completely. The movement stopped Luke cold. He had seen Ruby gentle enough to take apple slices from a child's palm. But this Ruby was different. She was not wild with rage. She was worse than that. She was certain. Every line of her body said that Annie was not a case, not a problem, not a body to be handled by people in boots and gloves. Dr. Hannah lowered the viewer, her face pale beneath the brim of her hat. She told Clara that if Annie was alive, time mattered. If Annie was gone, they still needed to know why. A hidden illness could endanger the whole herd. Clara listened, but her eyes stayed on Ruby, who had lowered her trunk again and touched the calf's mouth with unbearable care. For a moment, Ruby seemed to wait. Her trunk hovered just above Annie's nostrils, so still the morning itself appeared to pause with her. Then she touched the little chest. Once, twice, slowly enough that even Luke stopped breathing as he watched. It looked less like an animal checking a body and more like a mother asking the world for one small answer. Clara lifted her hand and gave the order no one wanted. They would hold position. No engines past the service gate, no dart guns, no crew moving in until the herd gave them space or danger made waiting impossible. Luke turned away in frustration, but Clara did not look at him. She was looking at Ruby, who had placed herself over Annie like a living prayer. The sun rose higher, pressing heat into the red ground. Flies returned, and Ruby brushed them away again and again, patient beyond reason. Around her, the herd settled into a watchful quiet, as if they had accepted the shape of the day before the humans could. Clara stood outside that circle, her old life-saving hands empty at her sides, beginning to understand that this pain had its own door, and Ruby was the only one allowed to open it. The morning heat began to lift from the red ground in slow waves, turning the wash into a shimmering bowl of dust and light. Ruby felt it first through the pads of her feet, the way the earth warmed beneath Annie's still body. She stood with her shadow over the calf's face, moving only when the flies came too close. Beyond the circle, the humans had gathered in a line they believed was respectful. Ruby knew distance differently. She could smell their worry sharpening in the air, could hear the soft clink of metal in Dr. Hannah's case, the low rumble of the waiting truck, the nervous shift of Luke's boots in the sand. None of it belonged inside the circle. Clara stood closest, but even she did not cross the line Ruby had drawn without moving. The woman's eyes stayed on Annie, then on Ruby, then back again, carrying a pain Ruby could not name but seemed to recognize. There was no threat in Clara's posture, yet Ruby kept her ears half spread. Love had made her careful. Dr. Hannah lifted the thermal viewer again, angling it over Martha's shoulder from far across the wash. She whispered something to Clara, and Luke's face tightened. Ruby did not know their words, but she felt their meaning pass through the group like wind before lightning. They wanted to come closer. They wanted to touch what was hers. Martha shifted first. The old matriarch lowered her head, not in anger, but in warning. Daisy pressed against her side, trembling with a grief too young to understand. Ruby answered by stepping over Annie's front legs, placing one massive foot beside the calf's folded ear. Her body became a gate no hand had permission to open. The white veterinary truck rolled forward only a few feet. Its tires crushed dry brush with a sound so small that on any other morning no one would have noticed. But Ruby heard it as if it were thunder. Her trunk rose, tasting diesel, rubber, medicine, and fear. Then she took one slow step toward the sound. Luke raised both hands and froze. Dr. Hannah called for the driver to stop. Clara's voice cut through the air, calm but strained, telling everyone not to move. The truck settled into silence, its engine ticking softly. Ruby stood between it and Annie, her eyes fixed on the humans, her ears now fully open like dark, living shields. For several long seconds, nothing moved except the dust. The sanctuary seemed to wait for a mistake. One shout, one slammed door, one frightened step could have turned sorrow into panic. Ruby did not charge because this was not rage. It was something heavier. It was a mother telling the world that help, if forced, could become another kind of harm. Then Annie's trunk shifted in the wind. It was only the lightest movement, a loose curve stirred by a passing breath of air. But Ruby turned so quickly that Clara gasped. The mother bent down, touching the calf's mouth, then her cheek, then the small hollow where life should have been answering. For one terrible heartbeat, everyone hoped. Ruby waited. Her trunk hovered over Annie's nostrils, still as a held prayer. The humans watched from the road, afraid even to blink. Daisy made a soft, broken sound from behind Martha, and Ruby answered with a low rumble that rolled through the ground. But Annie did not rise. Annie did not breathe. The wind moved on without mercy. Luke turned away, wiping his face with the back of his wrist. Dr. Hannah lowered the viewer and closed her eyes, as if the answer had already begun to arrive before science could prove it. Clara did not speak. She only looked at Ruby, who remained bent over her calf, touching the same place again and again, refusing to let silence have the final word. The crew backed away farther this time. The truck reversed until its white shape blurred beyond the heat. Ruby watched until the smell of it thinned, then returned to Annie's side. Martha eased the circle wider by a few steps, not enough to invite the humans in, only enough to let the herd breathe. Grief had held its ground. By afternoon, Ruby's shadow had moved across Annie's body and shortened beneath the sun. She brushed dust from the calf's eye, then stood still with her trunk resting near Annie's chest. Beyond the wash, the humans waited with their tools unused and their answers out of reach. Inside the circle, Ruby kept watch, and the day grew older around a mother who would not yet let go. By late morning, the heat had settled over Red Mesa like a hand pressed flat against the earth. Ruby stood in the middle of it, unmoving except for the slow return of her trunk to Annie's face. The calf's small body had gathered dust along every soft curve, and each time the wind laid more red sand across her, Ruby brushed it away. The herd had found a rhythm the humans could only watch from a distance. Martha kept her place toward the open wash, broad and steady, reading the wind with one torn ear. Daisy stayed behind her, restless and frightened, lifting her trunk whenever Ruby bent down. The younger elephant wanted to come closer, but grief had its own order, and Martha would not let her rush it. Ruby touched Annie's ear first, then the corner of her mouth, then the place beneath her cheek, where the skin still held the sweetness of babyhood. She did not push. She did not shake. She touched as if the calf were sleeping beside her after a long day, as if one wrong movement might wake her too roughly or admit a truth Ruby was not ready to carry. Clara watched through binoculars from the service road, though she lowered them often because the sight felt too private. She had seen mothers in hospital rooms press their palms to still faces, whispering names no machine could answer. But Ruby had no words to spend, no bargain to offer. Her language was touch, and every touch seemed to ask the same impossible question. Luke stood beside the veterinary truck, quiet now. His anger from the morning had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. He kept looking at the equipment in Dr. Hannah's open case, then back at Ruby's trunk as it moved over Annie with a patience that hurt to witness. For the first time, his need to do something began to look small beside Ruby's need to stay. Around noon, the first flies thickened in the heat. Ruby noticed before anyone else. Her trunk swept them from Annie's eyes, then from the soft fold behind one ear. When they returned, she swept them away again. The motion was so simple that it nearly broke Clara. A mother could not make the heart beat again, but she could still keep the flies off her child. Then Daisy made a mistake. Shaking with nerves, she stepped past Martha and pushed toward the center, her young trunk reaching for Annie. Ruby lifted her head sharply, and for one breath, the whole circle tightened. Daisy froze, confused and ashamed. Martha touched the young elephant's shoulder and guided her back, not harshly, but with the quiet firmness of an elder protecting more than a body. That small movement unsettled the herd. Two elephants shifted closer. Dust rose around their feet. Ruby turned in a slow half circle, placing herself over Annie again, her ears spread wide. She was not angry with Daisy. She was guarding the fragile space where her daughter still belonged to her, where no one, not even family, could rush the long road toward goodbye. Beyond the fence, a new sound entered the day. Tires on gravel, doors closing, human voices that did not know how to be gentle. A photo from someone's phone had traveled faster than any warning Clara could give. And now, strangers were gathering at the sanctuary gate, demanding answers about the baby elephant left lying in the dust. Ruby could not see the people clearly from the wash, but she felt the change move through the ground. The herd felt it too. Martha turned toward the distant noise. Daisy pressed closer to the older females. Ruby lowered her trunk to Annie's chest and held it there, as if the world outside the circle had become a storm she needed to shield her calf from. A drone rose above the far fence with a thin mechanical whine. It floated like an insect made of metal, edging toward the wash. Ruby's head lifted at once. The sound cut through the heat, sharp and unnatural. Martha stepped forward and blew dust from her trunk, while the whole herd drew inward until Annie disappeared behind a wall of gray bodies. Clara saw it and snapped into motion. She shouted for the drone to be grounded, her voice carrying across the yard with a force that made even Luke turn. Dr. Hannah ran toward the gate. The drone wavered, then backed away. But the damage had already been done. Ruby remained tense, her ears wide, her trunk curled over Annie as though even the sky could no longer be trusted. When the noise finally faded, Red Mesa grew quiet again, but it was not the same quiet. The herd stood closer now. Ruby bent down and touched Annie's face one more time, slower than before, almost apologizing for a world that would not leave them alone. The sun began to tilt west, laying long shadows over the wash and softening the hard red glare. As evening approached, Clara ordered everyone farther back. No engines, no cameras near the fence, no more chances for strangers to turn mourning into spectacle. Ruby did not know the words, but she seemed to feel the space widen. Her ears loosened. Her trunk rested beside Annie's cheek. Inside the circle, the mother kept watch, and every touch remained a prayer the living could not translate. Night came slowly to Red Mesa, not like a curtain falling, but like a hand dimming the world 1 inch at a time. The red wash cooled under the fading sky, and the heat that had tortured the day rose off the ground in thin, trembling waves. Ruby remained beside Annie, her body dusted pale, her trunk still resting near the calf's face. The herd settled into darkness without truly resting. Martha stood toward the service road, a dark shape against the last orange light. Daisy leaned close to an older female, her young body tired from grief she could not understand. But Ruby did not lean, did not lower herself, did not look away. Her world had narrowed to the small body at her feet. Beyond the fence, the human noise had thinned. The drone was gone. The strangers at the gate had been pushed back. Clara had ordered the floodlights turned low, leaving only a few dim amber lamps near the road. From where Ruby stood, the humans became shadows and scents, softened by distance, no longer pressing against the circle like hands at a door. Still, Ruby remembered every sound. The truck, the metal case, the sharp whine above the fence. She stood over Annie as if the darkness itself might try to take her. Each time the wind crossed the wash, she lowered her trunk and touched the calf's cheek, making sure dust had not covered the eyes she could no longer see open. Clara sat in her patrol vehicle with the window cracked, wrapped in a jacket she had forgotten to zip. She could barely make out Ruby's outline, but she knew exactly where the mother stood. Dr. Hannah was beside the veterinary truck, reviewing distant readings in silence. Luke sat on the bumper, elbows on his knees, no longer angry enough to hide that he was afraid. Near midnight, the desert became so quiet that small things sounded enormous. A chain clicked against a gate. Gravel settled under a tire. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote called once and then stopped. Ruby lifted her head, listening past all of it, listening to a place no human ear could reach, where the herd had already begun to speak. The first rumble came from Martha. It rolled so low through the ground that Clara felt it in her chest before she understood it was sound. Then another elephant answered, and another. The vibration moved beneath Ruby's feet, steady and deep, circling Annie like water around a stone. Ruby closed her eyes and let the sound pass through her. It was not a cry for help. It was not panic. It carried no sharp edge of danger. The rumble was old, patient, almost unbearable in its gentleness. Ruby answered at last, her own sound rising from somewhere deeper than breath. It moved through her body and into the earth, as if she were speaking to Annie through the ground that held them both. Inside the vehicle, Clara stopped breathing for a moment. She had heard families pray in hospital rooms, not always with words, sometimes with silence, sometimes with one hand wrapped around another. But this was different. The sound from the elephants did not ask the night to change its mind. It only gathered around what could not be changed. Dr. Hannah stepped closer to Clara's window and whispered that the thermal readings were nearly gone. She did not say the rest. She did not have to. Clara looked toward the circle, where Ruby's dark shape bent again over Annie. The mother touched the calf's chest, waited, then touched it again, as if she had not yet agreed to the truth science was ready to name. A light wind moved through the wash and lifted Annie's small ear just enough to make Daisy startle. The young elephant gave a broken chirp and stepped forward, but Martha blocked her with a slow, heavy turn of the shoulder. Ruby did not move away from Annie. She only laid her trunk across the calf's neck, holding her there against the wind, against the night, against goodbye. The rumbling continued in long, soft waves. Sometimes Ruby answered. Sometimes she stood silent while the herd spoke around her. Clara could not know what passed between them, but she felt the meaning of it settle over the sanctuary. This was not waiting anymore. This was a vigil. This was a family keeping watch until one heart was ready to release another. Toward dawn, the sound faded. The eastern sky softened from black to gray, and the red land slowly returned. Ruby was still standing, but something in her had changed. She looked older beneath the dust, heavier in the shoulders, yet calmer than before. Annie lay quiet at her feet, and Ruby touched her once more as morning arrived, not with hope, but with a sorrow beginning to understand its own shape. Morning did not arrive gently. It came pale and thin over Red Mesa, washing the dark from the stones and revealing what the night had refused to soften. Ruby still stood over Annie, dust gathered along her spine, her trunk hanging low beside the calf's face. She had not moved far enough for the ground beneath her feet to cool. The herd woke without waking, because none of them had truly slept. Martha shifted her weight and faced the road. Daisy leaned against an older female, her eyes heavy, her young trunk curled tight with uncertainty. Ruby bent again toward Annie, touching the same small places she had touched all night, as if love could memorize a body before the world took it away. Across the wash, Clara stood beside Dr. Hannah while the first full reading came through. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The device in Hannah's hands only confirmed what Ruby's silence had already been carrying. Annie was gone. Not fading. Not barely holding on. Gone in the quiet, final way that made every tool suddenly feel too late. Ruby did not hear the words, but she felt the humans change. Their grief sharpened into purpose. Feet moved. Doors opened softly. Someone spoke into a phone. The air filled again with decisions. Ruby lifted her head, ears loosening, then spreading wider. She knew that sound. It was the sound of humans believing the waiting was over. But for Ruby, nothing was over. Annie still lay beneath her shadow. The calf still needed the dust brushed from her eyes, the flies kept from her mouth, the hot sun broken by her mother's body. Death had entered the circle, but it had not been given permission to finish its work. Ruby stepped closer until her front legs framed Annie like pillars. Luke stood near the maintenance truck, his face gray with sleeplessness. He had stopped blaming Clara out loud, but guilt moved through him in rough, restless gestures. He looked at Annie, then at the equipment waiting under a tarp. In his mind, the question kept turning. If they had pushed harder, if they had moved faster, would the little calf still be there? Dr. Hannah spoke carefully. The day would grow hot. They could not leave Annie in the open forever. They needed to examine her, to understand what happened, to protect Ruby and the rest of the herd from any unseen danger. Clara listened with her arms folded tight across her chest, staring at Ruby as the mother lowered her trunk again to Annie's still cheek. By noon, the order came from the sanctuary office. Prepare for removal. Keep it quiet. Keep it controlled. But do it before the heat made everything harder. Clara did not answer at first. She looked toward the circle, where Ruby stood in the brutal light, not wild, not confused, not finished. The mother was no longer waiting for life. She was waiting for goodbye. The vehicle came slowly from the far service road, a low flatbed with a lift hidden beneath canvas. Its engine was softer than the veterinary truck, but Ruby felt it through the ground before it came into view. Martha felt it too. The old matriarch turned and took one heavy step forward, placing herself between the machine and the herd. Daisy panicked first. She gave a sharp, broken cry and pressed inward, bumping against another female. Dust rose in sudden clouds. Ruby moved faster than she had all morning, swinging her body across Annie until the calf disappeared beneath the shield of her mother's chest and legs. Her trunk curled over Annie's neck, claiming what the world was trying to take. The flatbed stopped, but it had already come too close. Martha threw dust into the air with a hard blast from her trunk. Two older females stepped shoulder to shoulder behind Ruby. The circle tightened until there was no center left to see. Only massive bodies, flared ears, and a silence so dangerous it made every human understand how thin their plans really were. Luke shouted for the driver to back up. Dr. Hannah raised both hands, telling everyone to hold. Clara ran before she had time to think, boots sliding in the red dirt as she placed herself in front of the vehicle. Her voice cracked when she ordered it to stop for good. Then she turned toward the others and said what the whole morning had been trying to teach them. "We are not waiting for Annie to wake up," Clara said, breath shaking in her throat. "We are waiting for Ruby to let go." The words crossed the wash quietly, but they changed the shape of the day. Even Luke stopped moving. Even Dr. Hannah lowered her eyes. Ruby stood behind them, still covering Annie, as if the mother had known that truth all along. The vehicle reversed until its sound faded behind the ridge. The crew backed away. The radios went silent one by one. Only then did Ruby loosen her hold. She touched Annie's face, then her chest, then the curve of one folded ear. The circle widened by a few slow steps, not opening, only breathing again after nearly breaking. Afternoon drifted into a tired gold. Ruby remained beside Annie, but her body no longer fought every shadow. Martha stood close, guarding the edge of the wash. Daisy watched from behind her, calmer now, as if she had learned that grief could be held without being rushed. Far away, Clara stayed by the road, understanding that the hardest work had not been saving Annie. It was giving Ruby the time to lose her. The second night settled over Red Mesa without argument. No engines waited at the service road. No camera lights blinked near the fence. Clara had pushed the humans back until the sanctuary felt almost empty again. Ruby stood in the wide dark beside Annie, and for the first time since the storm, the world around her seemed willing to be quiet. The herd kept a looser circle now, but no one truly left. Martha faced the road with the patience of an old guardian, her torn ear lifting whenever the wind changed. Daisy stood farther back, calmer than before, as if the long hours had taught her that grief was not a thing to escape. Ruby remained closest, her trunk resting near Annie's cheek. Before dawn, the air turned cold enough to silver the edges of the fence. Ruby had not slept, yet her body had entered a stillness deeper than exhaustion. She touched Annie less often now, not because love had weakened, but because something inside her had begun to understand that no touch could call the calf back from where she had gone. Clara watched from the darkened patrol vehicle, afraid to move too much. Dr. Hannah sat beside her, hands folded around a cup of coffee gone cold. Luke stood outside near the hood, his cap pressed against his chest. None of them had been asked to witness this, yet none of them could leave. They knew morning would bring, something the night had been preparing. The first light rose pale behind the red ridge. It did not strike the wash all at once. It reached slowly, touching the backs of the elephants, the old dust on Martha's shoulders, the curve of Annie's small body beneath Ruby's shadow. Ruby lifted her head toward the light, and the herd seemed to feel the change before the humans saw it. Martha moved first. She took one step to the side, then another, opening a narrow path toward the center. The other females followed with a quiet order that made the air feel ceremonial. Daisy hesitated, then backed away with them. The circle did not break in panic. It opened like a gate only Ruby had been waiting to walk through. Ruby stood alone with Annie in the space the herd had made. For a long moment, she did nothing. Her ears hung heavy, her trunk curled and uncurled above the calf's face, tasting the dust, the morning, the last faint scent of her daughter. Then she stepped closer. So slowly, Clara felt each movement land in her own chest. The mother lowered her head until her trunk lay across Annie's forehead. She held it there, unmoving. No rumble came from her at first, no cry. Only the terrible quiet of a mother measuring the distance between what she loved and what she could no longer protect. Even the birds along the fence seemed to withhold their morning calls. Then Ruby began to kneel. It took time. Her front legs bent first, trembling beneath the weight of her grief. Dust rose around her knees in soft red clouds. Her great body folded in sections, not collapsing, not falling, but lowering, with a care that made every human watching feel they were seeing something no person had the right to interrupt. Dr. Hannah lifted her phone out of habit, then stopped. Her hand sank slowly to her lap. Luke turned his face away, but only for a second, because looking away felt wrong too. Clara pressed her fingers against her mouth and did not speak. Every tool they had brought, every plan they had made, seemed useless before the quiet dignity of Ruby's descent. Ruby settled beside Annie, her body curved around the calf as much as the earth allowed. She placed her trunk along Annie's face, then drew it slowly down to the small chest that would never rise again. She held it there. The gesture was not a check for life anymore. It was a final remembering, a mother touching the place where hope had lived. A low sound moved through the herd, softer than the rumbles of the night. Martha answered from the edge of the circle. Daisy lowered her head. One by one, the elephants stood still, their trunks hanging, their bodies facing inward now. They were no longer guarding Annie from the world. They were holding Ruby as she reached the hardest part of goodbye. Ruby stayed kneeling long after the sun cleared the ridge. The light warmed Annie's dusty ear and shone along the curve of Ruby's tusk. Finally, the mother lifted her trunk from the calf's chest and laid it once more across Annie's face, gentle as a blanket. Then she rose slowly, carrying a silence that seemed heavier than her body. When Ruby stood, Martha entered the center. The old matriarch came close to Annie, touched her once with the tip of her trunk, and stepped away. Another elephant followed. Then another. Daisy came last among them, trembling, and barely brushed the calf's side before retreating to Martha's shadow. Each touch was brief, but each one seemed to leave something behind. Ruby watched them all. She did not stop them now. The space she had guarded for 2 days and 2 nights was no longer closed. Her daughter had been loved by the herd, and now the herd was answering that love in the only way it could. The circle had not been forced open by machines or men. It had opened from the inside when Ruby was finally ready. By mid-morning, only Ruby remained beside Annie. The others stood a short distance away, waiting without pressure. Clara felt the ache of that patience. No one rushed the mother. No one called her forward. Ruby lowered her trunk one final time, touched Annie's mouth, and stood over her in the red light, caught between staying forever and surviving the next step. Ruby stood alone in the open circle, with Annie at her feet and the herd waiting behind her. The morning had grown warmer, but she seemed untouched by time now. Dust rested along her back, in the folds around her eyes, across the curve of her trunk. She had guarded Annie through storm, heat, darkness, and human fear. Now the only thing left to face was leaving. Martha waited several yards away, still as stone. Daisy pressed close to her side, watching Ruby with the stunned quiet of the young. None of the elephants moved forward. None of them called. They gave the mother the one gift the world had tried to take from her since the beginning: enough silence to decide when goodbye could begin. Ruby lowered her trunk to Annie's mouth one last time. She touched the small curve where breath had once warmed the dust. Then she moved to the folded ear, the cheek, the chest. Each touch was slower than the one before. as if she were gathering pieces of her calf into memory. No sound came from Ruby, but her whole body spoke of a love too large for noise. Clara watched from the road with Dr. Hannah and Luke beside her. Nobody held a camera now. Nobody checked a device. Luke's cap hung in both hands, crushed between his fingers. Dr. Hannah's face was wet, though she did not wipe it. Clara could barely breathe, because she understood that Ruby was doing what so many human hearts had failed to do gently. At last, Ruby turned her body toward the herd. She took one step, then another. The movement was so slow that it almost did not look like walking. Behind her, Annie remained in the red dust, small and still beneath the widening sky. Ruby stopped after 5 steps and turned her head back, as if some invisible part of her had stayed behind and was calling her name. The herd did not rush her. Martha waited. Daisy waited. Even the wind seemed to hold itself low to the ground. Ruby turned forward again, took a few more steps, then looked back once more. Her body moved toward survival, but her heart kept circling the place where Annie lay. Every backward glance tore the morning open a little wider. When Ruby finally reached Martha, the old matriarch touched her shoulder with the side of her trunk. It was not a command. It was not comfort in the human way. It was simply contact, the ancient language of a herd reminding one grieving mother that she did not have to carry the next step alone. Ruby leaned into it for one brief, shaking moment. Together, the elephants began to move toward the red ridge. Daisy looked back once, copying Ruby without understanding the full weight of it. The others followed in a slow line, their shadows stretching across the wash. Ruby walked near the rear, stopping twice more before the ridge took her from sight. The final time, she faced Annie for so long that Clara thought she might return. But Ruby did not return. She lifted her trunk slightly, not high enough to call, only enough to let the morning pass beneath it. Then she turned and followed the herd over the rise. One by one, their backs vanished into the red light until the wash was empty except for Annie, the soft marks of elephant feet, and a silence that no longer felt like refusal. Only then did Clara move. She raised one hand, and the veterinary team came forward without engines, without loud voices, without the urgency that had nearly broken everything the day before. Luke walked at the front, slower than anyone. When he reached Annie, he bowed his head before touching the white sheet, as if asking permission from the space Ruby had left behind. Dr. Hannah examined Annie with quiet care. The answer, when it came, was both simple and cruel. The storm had hidden a shallow washout beneath loose sand. Annie had slipped, fallen hard, and suffered injuries too deep for any hand to undo by the time morning found her. There was no sickness in the herd, no blame that could be placed neatly anywhere. Only an accident, and a mother who had known before the humans did. Clara found the red ribbon caught on the fence near the wash. Children from Flagstaff had tied it there months earlier on the day Annie was born, laughing as the calf chased her own ears in the dust. Clara held it for a while, then tied it to a low cedar post where Ruby's circle had stood. She did not make a speech. Some memorials were stronger when they stayed small. Weeks later, Ruby passed that place with the herd. Clara saw her from the office window and stepped outside without calling anyone. Ruby slowed near the ribbon. She did not trumpet. She did not reach for it. She only stood there, facing the red strip of cloth moving in the wind, while Martha and the others waited behind her with the same patient silence as before. After several minutes, Ruby turned and walked on. This time, she did not look back as often. Clara felt the difference and wept because it was not forgetting. It was something braver. Red Mesa later changed its policy and gave it Annie's name. Time for a herd to stand with its dead before humans stepped in. And Ruby kept walking, carrying her daughter not in her trunk, but in every quiet step that followed. If Ruby's story touched your heart, leave a simple comment below. Comment 1 if you believe animals grieve more deeply than most people realize. Comment 0 if you think Ruby deserved those 3 quiet days to say goodbye in her own way. And if you want to see more emotional animal stories about love, loss, loyalty, and the quiet moments that remind us what compassion really means, please subscribe to the channel. There are more unforgettable stories waiting for you, and I'd be honored to have you with us for the next one.